2 hours ago, Mark Carney walked onto a stage in Montreal and detonated a financial charge directly underneath the American defense industry. No ultimatum. No warning call to Washington. He simply walked to the podium, looked into the cameras, and told a room full of delegates that the era of Canada spending its own defense budget to enrich American weapons manufacturers was permanently over. The words were precise, and they landed like a verdict. The days of sending 70 cents of every defense dollar to the United States are behind us. The applause started before he finished the sentence. It lasted 4 minutes. Every delegate in that hall was on their feet. And somewhere in the corridors of the Pentagon, someone was already reaching for a phone. To understand why this moment is seismic, you need to understand the architecture of what Carney just dismantled. For decades, Canada's defense procurement system has operated as a quiet subsidy to American industrial giants. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman. These companies have captured roughly 70% of every Canadian defense contract for a generation. Canada has been, in practical terms, one of the most reliable and least contested customers the American defense industry has ever had. Billions of dollars flowed south with almost no political friction, no reciprocal obligation, and no strategic review. Ottawa bought American, consistently and quietly, while Canadian manufacturers watched the contracts pass them by. Carney's announcement reverses that equation entirely. Effective immediately, 70% of Canadian defense procurement will be directed to domestic firms. Canadian steel, Canadian aluminum, Canadian labor. The math is brutal for Washington. Canada's defense budget has just hit NATO's 2% GDP threshold, 5 years ahead of schedule. That means the total procurement pool is larger than at any point in recent history. And 70% of a growing budget just moved out of reach for American contractors overnight. The White House did not see this coming in this form. The assumption inside the administration was that Carney's anger over tariff pressure was performative, that the economic logic of North American integration would keep Canada in line, that the defense relationship was untouchable, that no Canadian Prime Minister would dare risk the interoperability of joint continental systems over a procurement policy dispute. That assumption is now in ruins. What the administration failed to account for is that Carney is not a career politician calculating his next election cycle. He is a central banker who spent his professional life identifying structural vulnerabilities in financial systems and then building protection against them. He did not react to Trump's tariff escalation. He absorbed it, mapped its pressure points, and designed a counter that strikes where American exposure is most concentrated. Not in trade volumes, but in the institutional dependency that Washington never thought to defend. Before we get into what Washington is now scrambling to contain, if you have found this analysis valuable, hit subscribe and like this video. It is the clearest signal you can send that this kind of deep strategic breakdown is what you want more of. Now here is why the defense industry reaction was immediate, and why the damage is structural, not symbolic. Lockheed Martin's Canadian exposure is not marginal. The F-35 program, the C-130 logistics fleet, the naval systems integration contracts, Canada has been a consistent anchor client for decades. Raytheon holds air defense contracts. Boeing's military division depends on Canadian procurement cycles for production volume projections. When Carney announced the 70% domestic redirect, these companies did not wait for analysts to model the impact. Their government relations teams were already in emergency contact with Capitol Hill within the hour. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce issued a statement calling the procurement shift a fundamental restructuring of North American defense cooperation. That phrase, fundamental restructuring, is the tell. It means this is not a policy dispute that gets resolved in a bilateral meeting. It means the supply chain relationships that were treated as permanent are now explicitly conditional. But this is where it becomes more serious than a procurement reallocation. Carney's announcement contained a second strategic vector that most initial coverage missed entirely. Canada is not simply redirecting its defense spending inward. It is simultaneously redirecting its defense export ambitions outward, toward Europe and the United Kingdom. Carney signaled that Canada intends to double its non-American defense exports over the next decade, with the European Union and the UK as the primary destinations. This matters because it means Canadian defense industry capacity, which will now be dramatically expanded by domestic procurement, is being positioned to compete directly with American manufacturers in allied markets. Washington did not just lose a customer, it gained a competitor, one that shares intelligence frameworks, interoperability standards, and NATO doctrine with every market it is now entering. The NATO dimension of this announcement is the one that has caused the deepest discomfort inside the administration. Trump has spent years weaponizing the 2% GDP spending commitment as a blunt instrument against allies. The argument was always the same. Canada is free-riding on American security guarantees, spending below its obligation and expecting Washington to carry the load. That argument is now structurally unavailable. Carney confirmed that Canada has met the 2% threshold this year, not by 2029, not by 2032, but now. The administration's most reliable rhetorical lever against Ottawa has been removed. And it was removed at the exact moment Carney announced that the money being spent to meet that target would not flow to American firms. He hit the target and redirected the spending in the same sentence. The precision of that is not accidental. It was designed to close every rhetorical door simultaneously. The American business community's reaction has moved beyond concern into something closer to alarm. Senior executives from the aerospace and defense sector have begun privately warning congressional offices that the procurement redirect, if it holds, will affect production timelines, workforce projections, and contract renewal assumptions across multiple platforms. The language being used in those calls is not diplomatic. Several industry representatives have described the situation as a self-inflicted wound, the result of tariff pressure that was calibrated to extract trade concessions, but instead triggered a procurement revolution in America's most stable allied defense market. The irony is not lost on anyone. Washington applied pressure to Canada to gain economic compliance. What it received instead was a Canadian defense industry expansion program explicitly designed to replace American suppliers. Internationally, the framing has shifted in ways the White House has not yet publicly acknowledged. Germany, France, and the UK have all noted Carney's announcement with visible approval. The European defense industrial base has been under pressure to expand since Russia's invasion of Ukraine created sustained procurement demand that American capacity could not fully satisfy. A newly aggressive Canadian defense industry, operating with domestic procurement as its foundation and European export as its ambition, fits directly into the gap that European nations have been trying to fill. Canada did not need to formally announce a pivot toward European defense cooperation. Carney's procurement policy makes that pivot structurally inevitable. And what makes this move so strategically complete is the preparation that preceded it. This was not improvised in response to tariff pressure. Canadian officials with direct knowledge of the procurement review have indicated that the domestic sourcing framework was developed over more than a year, quietly, with input from Canadian aerospace firms, steel producers, and technology manufacturers. The infrastructure for this redirect, the regulatory framework, the supplier qualification process, the capacity modeling, was built in advance. Carney did not announce an aspiration. He announced an operational plan that was already designed and ready to execute. Washington is only now realizing that the negotiating leverage it thought it held, Canadian dependence on the defense relationship, was being dismantled in planning sessions it had no visibility into. Trump now faces three options, and none of them restore the position the administration held 48 hours ago. He can escalate tariff pressure further, but the procurement redirect is now a policy decision by a sovereign government, and retaliating against it with tariffs harms Canadian consumers, not Canadian defense contractors. He can attempt to use NORAD interoperability as leverage, suggesting that the procurement shift creates integration problems. But that argument requires admitting that American systems depend on Canadian cooperation as much as the reverse, which contradicts the entire framing of Canada as a dependent partner. Or he can quietly absorb the shift and negotiate bilaterally on defense industrial cooperation going forward, which means accepting a fundamentally different relationship where Canada is a defense partner on equal commercial terms rather than a captive procurement market. Every path forward requires conceding something the administration publicly insisted it would never concede. The room for maneuver has narrowed to almost nothing. 2 hours ago, Washington thought its tariff leverage was creating pressure that would eventually force Ottawa into compliance. 2 hours later, Canada has restructured its defense budget, eliminated American firms from the majority of its procurement pipeline, positioned its emerging defense industry to compete in European markets, and removed the NATO spending argument from Trump's rhetorical arsenal. Carney did not fire back. He simply executed a plan that had already been completed. The White House thought it was applying pressure. It turns out it was being maneuvered into position. And the move it triggered is one that cannot be undone with a phone call